Lying Ways by Rachel Lynch. Read by Clare Kissane. Chapter 1. Enjoy your holiday, Dinger. Don't rush back. The prison officer's farewell was laced with affection for the older man. Jack Bell had been a quiet and respectful convict, what you might call a good sort. Unlike some of the offenders inside Her Majesty's prison, Highton. Dinger's eyes didn't suggest a violent or sadistic past. In fact, they were more like sparkling portals to a grand old soul, more suited to a kind grandfather. His hands were huge, but gentle, and he spoke to the prison staff respectfully, especially Jeannie. She was his favourite. He spent most of his time banged up in his cell, like the others, shuffling around in his burgundy slippers, sent to him by his loving niece. But he was also let out more than most, thanks to his library job, delivering books and papers up and down the corridors. Jack had been known as Dinger most of his adult life, and inside prison was no different. Tags and labels made existence easier on the inside. Dinger Bell. It was about the least clever or original sobriquet a bunch of heads could muster up. But then these were criminal minds, and lads at that. They were just babies, some of them, which is why Jeannie was so popular. She was a mother figure to them, from the 60 and 70-year-olds who'd never leave here, to the teenagers, arriving pale and terrified, bulging at the seams with regret and the realisation that they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives. On Dinger's first morning, 13 years ago, she'd spotted him at breakfast as she patrolled the room, chatting to the lads about what they'd missed. Good food, family, football and the like. She'd welcomed the new arrival warmly, and they'd chatted for a while about his family and his love of fishing. Dinger, like Jeannie, was a Cumbrian, born and bred. As a girl, Jeannie's father had taken her to catch trout from his boat on the lakes, which had licenses, and there were plenty of them. Munching on warm ham sandwiches, wrapped in saved, grease-proof paper, tied with string, staring into the clear water below, looking for ripples to indicate where the rainbow-coloured fish were feeding, was the overwhelming memory of her childhood. And it was a happy one. Dinger looked a bit like her father, but that was where the comparison ended. He was about the same height, 6'4", with broad shoulders, a wide jaw and grey hair. Even in his issued grey sweatpants and jumper, he looked smart. Jeannie figured it was a generation thing. They took pride in what they wore and made the best of it, like they were taught by their mothers. She felt safe when he was around. In the midst of the constant male threat that was part of her job, despite all her training and skills, Jack Bell was a source of comfort and security. Nowadays, Jeannie saw the young ones coming in with jeans around their hips, hoods over their faces, and tattoos all over their bodies, and they gave off a different vibe to the men of Jack's era. No matter their crime, there was something about a man who stood tall and proud, wearing cleaned and ironed clothes, that made one think him more innocent. In Category A prisons like Highton, the men weren't allowed to wear their own clothes because of the potential opportunities to conceal weapons and contraband. But they could still turn themselves out nicely, like Dinger. A final farewell look lingered between them as they said goodbye. Jeannie saw something in Jack's eyes and threw him a warning glance. CCTV was everywhere, and they'd kept their feelings for one another hidden from questioning stares. She was warning him not to let his guard down now, at the 11th hour, upon release, when finally they had the chance to meet up on freedom's terms. He got the message and turned away, taking in the view for one last time. He'd seen snippets of the desolate moor from his tiny cell window, and now he took in the whole thing and breathed the free air deeply. HMP Highton was an institution that not many folk knew about. Of course, if you lived within a 5-mile radius of the tiny village and shopped at the local co-op, then you'd be familiar with the high-security sprawl of concrete, metal and wire, built on peatland and heath, in between the rivers Esk and Urt. But the vast majority of the millions of visitors who crammed onto the Ravenglass Steam Railway every year, or hiked the Western Fells, had no idea. Neither did the tourists flocking to the nearby beaches on the coast of the Irish Sea. It existed in a bubble, sitting proudly on the ancient land that no one in their right mind would want to develop now. It'd be too expensive to dig adequate foundations into the edge of Halsenna Moor, and besides, it wouldn't be allowed. The wildlife habitat was protected. Back when the Victorians were looking for remote places to lock up their prisoners and forget about them, no one worried about preserving nature, just shooting, stuffing and framing it. So the prison had been built in 1843 and had stood on the windy, desolate moor ever since, welcoming some of Britain's worst offenders. The adult male population was made up of murderers, rapists, armed robbers and terrorists. Jeanie loved her job. She'd miss Jack Bell, though, brightening her shifts, though who knew where their relationship might go now that he was free. He was inside for armed burglary. He'd ended up in HMP Highton because the use of weapons had elevated the crime to Category A. Jeanie couldn't imagine Dinger being armed and dangerous. But then, most of the stories from the lads were the same. They were all in here because of some misunderstanding. Jeanie wasn't gullible or stupid. She knew the score. It's just that she saw the boys behind the men and felt empathy towards them, even the ones who refused to acknowledge their own humanity, burying it so it didn't make them weak. She still treated them the same. There were the real bad uns, of course, the ones who'd committed the worst crimes imaginable. Sometimes even Jeanie had trouble picturing some of the offences. But to her, they'd once been little boys, loved by their mothers and looking up to their papas. Along the way, something had gone wrong. With Dinger, it was his naive trust of folk that had got him into trouble, until he met Ricky Burton, who hunted for foot soldiers to do his bidding. During his 13-year stay at Highton, Dinger had clawed his way up the pecking order and created a comfortable life. He'd quickly worked out who was in charge and made the system work for himself, and he kept out of trouble. Dinger was street clever like that, and Jeanie watched how he observed those who'd put themselves in charge of the wings. Like Ricky. Prison wasn't much different to the outside, really, not when you look at it. It was an almighty test of survival, like a primary school playground. The only difference was that the physical boundaries were smaller, but the rules were the same. Dinger knew how to play the game, and thus he endured. Now, he was free of all that, and unchained. Free of Ricky. But the prison population was changing. Some of the old rules were not just being bent, but broken entirely. And Jeanie noted a certain stench infiltrating the wings. More attacks on prison officers were being logged, and they'd become more sinister and well-planned. The atmosphere of the typical clink had developed into something altogether more violent and disrespectful lately, and Jeanie knew it was because of alcohol and drugs, as well as staff shortages. There simply weren't enough officers to prevent substance abuse and the inevitable violence which followed. The hours of boredom, always a constant component of incarceration, hadn't changed, but the demographics of the penal population had, in conjunction with a decrease in funding. Less money and more bodies, along with brain-altering poisons, all combined to create a more uncertain environment for Jeanie to do her job. Dinger was getting out at the right moment, and that made her happy. In the 15 years Jeanie had worked at Highton, she'd been assaulted 5 times. Each time had been worse than the last. Every time she'd witnessed an assault on a member of staff, the convict had been intoxicated on something. They made hooch by mixing hand gel, fruit.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?